If there's one country out there that I hate as much as America, Britain, and France, it's gotta be the United Arab Emirates. I'm the #1 hater of the UAE. But this video isn't just about why I hate the UAE, it's about Sudan, British colonization, and Arabian imperialism. Although this is going to be a very serious historical video, I'ma keep and continue trashing the UAE, and I'm hoping you join in too. When I was an undergrad, I would often find myself wandering through libraries, looking for cool history books to read. One day I stumbled onto the most peculiar book. It was called something like The Making of Dubai, From Deserts to Skyscrapers. To a lot of white people, like the author of that book, or Adam something, Dubai and the Gulf states in general are seen as peak modernization in the Middle East. The puzzling question both Adam someone and this random old historian chased after were, how did Dubai become like this? It was deserts in the 1910s and now towers? What? How did this happen? How is it all possible? I aim to answer all of these very puzzling questions, but if you think you already know the answer, write it below. And make sure you like and subscribe for more history videos. Become my nakama. I'm currently gathering a crew of 10,000 pirates to find the One Piece. Any support is appreciated. For those who are curious, thinking I'm gonna drag the mystery of how Dubai went from a desert to whatever this is, the answer is slavery. It's slavery. In the present day, few living in the West ever question how their societies have been able to advance at such an astronomical pace. Few ever question or care about how they're able to enjoy all the benefits their society provides them. A simple set of reasoning is able to halt most serious thought while simultaneously providing a justification to why the global South has continued to become poorer and poorer. White Westerners tend to claim Western nations are simply rich and prosperous thanks to capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, and a secret missing ingredient, while global South nations are simply poor. It's like they were born poor. In the past, white people rationalized this head-scratching divide by analyzing the difference between a civilized society and what they deemed as an uncivilized society. These white and literally diseased people based the definition of civilized on a European ideal. The society had to be white, Christian, and if the society lacked these civilized features, they were deemed as applicable for conquest and colonization. I mean, they had to be civilized. Those ancient beliefs linger because when a white person like Mr. Beast looks at Africa, they see a barbarous, primitive place that is ripe for exploitation. The image of a poor global South has been imprinted into the psyches of white people, but it's a myth, a lie. Yellow Printy explains it better in his 1986 lecture.
But that expropriation of the third world has been going on for 400 years, brings us to another revelation. Namely, that the third world is not poor. You don't go to poor countries to make money. There are very few poor countries in this world. Most countries are rich. The Philippines are rich. Brazil is rich. Mexico is rich. Chile is rich. Only the people are poor. But there's billions to be made there, to be carved out and to be taken. There's been billions for 400 years. The capitalist European and North American powers have carved out and taken the timber, the flax, the hemp, the cocoa, the rum, the tin, the copper, the iron, the rubber, the bauxite, the slaves, and the cheap labor they have taken out of these countries. These countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited.
Even before Yellow Printy emerged, before he had his epic battles with microphones, Walter Rodney wrote how Europe underdeveloped Africa in 1972. And before Walter Rodney, in 1917, Vladimir Lenin wrote and explained how imperialism is the most advanced form of capitalism. So the head-scratching, puzzling question of how did Dubai become like this isn't really a grand mystery, but it is for racists. Racists who think Arabs are these primitive people who can't build shit and only have the capacity for destruction. The Gulf states and Saudi Arabia were able to speedrun their modernization because they received aid from the West while importing European imperial tactics to maintain their slave states. The contrast between a rich imperialist nation and an exploited African nation brings us to present-day Sudan. Like in occupied Palestine, there is a genocide in Sudan. The genocide is being committed by the UAE-backed Rapid Support Forces who have seized Western Sudan to mine gold. They have killed, murdered, starved, displaced 11 million people and underdeveloped an entire region so that Dubai can continue to be a city of gold. On January 7th, 2025, after 2 years since the Sudanese genocide began, the Biden administration finally acknowledged that there's a genocide in Sudan. They've placed sanctions on the RSF, but the root issue is dismissed. The UAE, like Israel, remains unpunished. Although this video will cover a dual history, the heart of this video is Sudan. Let this be a reminder for those who are apathetic, those who dismiss the plights of Africa, that the people of Africa are deserving of peace, dignity, and liberation.
俺はこの世界を変えてみせる。自由のため共に戦う意志のある者はこの船に乗れ。
However, I also believe that a crucial part of fighting imperialism is stopping people from dick riding the UAE. Stop supporting the UAE and instead help the people of Sudan. In respects to the Sudanese people, we begin the story in Sudan and not in the filthy, rotten slave states. Bilad Sudan has a long and turbulent history. It was and still is a land filled with a diverse people. The north and the south differed greatly. The north had closer ties to the Islamic world. The majority there were Muslims who spoke Arabic. The south and the west were populated by different tribes who practiced their own indigenous religions. Like Palestine, Sudan was not a barren, empty land. Rather, it was a land that was known by the Islamic world. Even though they did kind of give it a racist name. I mean, who came up with Bilad Sudan, the land of the blacks? Regardless of the name, the different tribes and people were not unified when the Egyptians invaded in the 1820s. This era is often referred to as the rule of Ar-Turki, where the Egyptians, like the British after them, exploited Sudanese labor. After 60 years of rule, the Sudani people revolted against their Egyptian occupiers in 1881. The man who led the revolt went by Al-Mahdi, which for those who don't know, I'm gonna pull you aside for a quick aside. In Islam, it's believed that around the time of the Day of Judgment, a Mahdi would arrive. It's claimed that he's a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. In Sudanese history, however, there have been a lot of self-proclaimed Mahdis. But Muhammad al-Mahdi fought and successfully liberated most of Sudan from Egyptian rule. Now, this could have been a slightly wonderful story if first Muhammad al-Mahdi wasn't such a terrible ruler who oppressed Coptic Christians, and if the British didn't invade Egypt in 1882 and placed General Gordon as Governor General in Khartoum, North Sudan. In 1882, as these white British-loving historians try to illustrate it, Mahdi forces attacked Khartoum, where Governor Gordon was stationed. Gordon was killed, and the British were expelled from Sudan. The battle and the victory was a small one, but it delivered a humiliating blow to the image of the mighty British Empire. For almost 6 years, Britain spewed propaganda of these savages who murdered Gordon. The British, who were enjoying luxury from underdeveloping Africa and colonizing the world, wanted revenge for Gordon. Britain, for those who don't know, is all the way over here, right? They wanted to bring law and order to Sudan, bring civilization, teach these so-called barbarous savages the meaning of civilization. Most of these rationales were smokescreens, but some of the genocidal level of violence inflicted in 1896 did stem from wanting revenge for Gordon. The scholar Michelle Gordon highlights 2 reasons why Britain invaded and colonized Sudan. The first is one most British historians use to justify Britain's part in colonizing Africa, in that Britain only colonized Africa to protect its sphere from the French and other European colonial powers. While this is true, it doesn't explain or justify Britain's genocidal violence. The second and the most true was that Britain and its colonial officers were humiliated by the Mahdi's victory. Michelle Gordon, however, adds a third: racism and white supremacy. The belief that the British were superior resulted in a pattern of genocide. Gordon's book covers 3 cases of genocide: Malay, Sierra Leone, and Sudan. In all these colonies, Michelle uncovers that the British enjoyed massacring and killing Africans. It was the British way. The 1889 Anglo-Egyptian invasion of Sudan was not a war, it was a genocide. Massacre after massacre followed, as the British hooked machine guns to trains. Sudanese people were starved by a British blockade. The wounded were hunted down and shot. Illegal ammunition was used, the type that exploded people. Finally, the British looted and plundered Sudan. In the eyes of the Sudanese, the true savages, the true barbarians, were the blood-soaked British. The general in charge of the blood and the death was Herbert Kitchener, a man whose motto was to win a war as fast as possible, regardless of the brutality. In fact, international law was waived throughout Africa. See, law, this European invention, couldn't be applied here, since the Europeans were fighting against savages. By 1899, Sudan was completely colonized by the British. They set up an Anglo-Egyptian condominium, but in reality, Egypt had no power. Although these British historians write about what a flowery time this all was, Britain used prisoners of war as slaves to build infrastructure and colonized Sudan. They built all of the government buildings, the governor's building, and the train tracks in the hellish heat. The British didn't care if POWs died while working, for that was the British way, a British tradition. Although Walter Rodney does not have a specific chapter on Sudan, his book and the many cases within it apply to how Britain crushed any political organization and underdeveloped Sudan, both politically and economically. See, the Sudanese were children, they were babies. The matters of the colonized state fell onto the adults, the rational, civilized British. The genocidal violence inflicted in 1896 most likely instilled a deep fear in Sudan. To rise and fight, to defy the British, meant to be massacred. Further, like French Algeria, Britain instilled and brutally taught that the Sudanese were uncivilized, and thus had to become more British to graduate into the rank of civilized. And so many Sudanese people looked up to these white men who were colonizing them. This is why Frantz Fanon stresses in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, that the colonized must first decolonize their minds, because these white people, these overlords, these disgusting, cruel, and twisted people are not friends of the colonized. Thus, for almost 20 years, Sudan was governed with an iron fist. When revolts, political thought, and political dissent did rise, the British cracked down. It wasn't until the end of World War II when the Sudani people began to organize politically and a vote was set up. By this time, Britain's power in the region had waned as Jamal Abdel Nasser came in and trashed the Egyptian bootlicking monarchy.
النهارده اما بيشتمونا طب ما احنا نقدر نشتمهم واحنا جريدنا ما تقدرش تشتم ملكة بريطانيا ولا رئيس وزراء بريطانيا ممكن قوي ما انتوا شتمتوهم هنا كتبت لهم ايه على الحيطه في بورسعيد احنا فاكرين الكلام بنجيب لهم الكلام اللي على الحيطه ونطلعه لهم قلت لهم يور كينج ايه.
The choice of the vote was to become independent, but still have political ties to Britain, or link up with Jamal Abdel Nasser, the Chads, Egypt, which may sound bad. It may sound like which may sound bad, but the Sudanese didn't trust Britain. They loathed Britain, and thus they didn't trust the party that still wanted to be friendly with their colonizers. And so in 1956, the Sudanese people voted to link up with Egypt, sending the British packing. But Sudan didn't join Egypt. It became independent.
نحن جند الله جند الوطن ادعى داعي الفداء لن نخن نتحدى الموت عند المحن نشتري المجد بأغلى ثمن هذه الأرض لنا فليعش سوداننا علما بين الأمم.
This is the UAE in the 1800s. To a lot of people, this may look backwards, uncivilized, and downright ugly. But wallahi, I would have preferred this region of the earth to have remained like this. The nation that is now known as the United Arab Emirates used to be a bunch of tiny little tribes, Arabs who settled in a very harsh region of the earth. The organization and forming of each tribe is long and turbulent. There were a lot of assassinations, a lot of overthrows of emirs over the years, but before the official forming of a federation, they were quite democratic. As if the tribe were displeased with their ruler, they would rise up and just kill them. The emir or sheikh, often a royal, would also visit his people, hear their plights, provide gifts and aid. To historians who look at this history from what the UAE became, this all seems kind of primitive, but this type of governance surpasses whatever the hell the UAE has today. We start in the 1800s, because a lot of people seem to be puzzled to how the UAE went from this to this in 200 odd years. And like Sudan, it mostly has to do with the British. Before the British landed onto these shores, the people of the UAE first met the Portuguese, who were racist fucks. The Portuguese stormed their shores and massacred Muslims, and I swear, if these Arabs kept hating Europeans, this history would have been a lot more brighter. In the 1800s, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Bahrain were coastal towns that had mixed economies. Some of these Arabs were nomadic Bedouins who migrated around with camels. Others stuck onto the coast, fishing and diving for pearls that they sold to Iran and other Arab countries. This is how Dubai was rediscovered by Europeans who were impressed with these pearls. Finally, the Gulf was a hotspot for pirates, smugglers, and slave traders. To a lot of historians, this early history is used to contrast the gains in modernization. They say, look at these primitive Arabs, so disconnected from the rest of the world. They don't have roads. They don't have plumbing. They live in mud huts. They didn't even have proper nations. For me, however, this is peak UAE. In the 1800s, British ships kept getting attacked by pirates in the Gulf. The Straw Hat Arabian pirates were doing some good work, tanking British ships. Britain, Great Britain, concluded that these ships originated from a place they called the Pirates' Cove. And thus they sent warships to bomb Dubai and parts of the UAE. This is how the relationship began. In 1820, the British took a different approach to combat the Straw Hat Arabian pirates. They forced each emir to sign a treaty. The terms were simple. Britain would protect the tribes by surveilling the Gulf waters with warships. And in the fine print, Britain would receive a cut from trade. However, British intervention in the region was a double-edged sword. Protection guaranteed each tribe a level of stability to grow and maintain power. This would aid the Emiratis greatly when oil was discovered in the late 1950s. However, like Africa, Britain stagnated the political growth of each tribe or city-state. British intervention normalized the rule of royal families, while Britain had total control over trade and foreign affairs. Fuck. On November 7th, 1928, the fate of the entire region was changed with the discovery of oil in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Britain would capitalize on this discovery by being even more friendly to the Arabs to build and expand more wells. The British and later Americans built the infrastructure and shipped the majority of the oil back home. However, Saudi Arabia did profit. This initial discovery of oil drove the British to search for oil in the rest of their Middle Eastern colonies, Egypt, Iraq, Yemen, and Transjordan. The amount of oil found in these regions delayed the oil found in the Gulf states. But in 1958, oil was discovered in Abu Dhabi. And in 1963, jealous little Dubai struck oil. Fuck. Although the emirs received a fortune from the discovery of oil, the treaties they signed in the 1800s backfired, as the British shipped most of it back home, seizing most of the initial profits. However, the 1950s and 60s were a very turbulent time, a time when the British Empire began to crumble. And so in 1971, the British left the Gulf, and a new nation was born, the United Arab Emirates. The fortune from the oil led the emirs to attempt to build a paradise on earth. The city-states and emirs would compete, each trying to build a better city. Abu Dhabi, having the head start, began modernizing much faster than the rest, but Dubai's emir, Sheikh Rashid, would gamble away almost everything to build ports. His gamble would pay off in 2001. The Gulf states speedrunning their modernization has gotten a lot of praise from Western academics who point at the UAE as a capitalist dream. These academics, try their very best to steer people away from questioning the nature of the state. Like, how is this all possible? Where is the wealth even coming from? Who built all this? Who built the ports? Who toiled in the oil rings? Who built these insanely tall ass towers? What's up with the difference in citizen rights? What about workers' rights? These academics know or should know the answer to these questions, but they just want people to forget about them by throwing that paradise image around. Like, did you know if you're a citizen, an Emirati, the government pays and rewards you? These emirs may be royal dictators who are billionaires, but their wealth is distributed. They're good billionaires. They're good dictators. You get to live in one of the greatest, one of the wealthiest cities on earth. Man-made islands, casinos, sex. I mean brothels. Just lots and lots of brothels. Others attempt to paint a progressive image, as they call the UAE the Las Vegas of the Middle East, a place where you can be Christian, Muslim, Jewish, atheist, Zionist, as long as you join in and gamble. A place that's so progressive, women can walk around half naked. A place where women can have an education, drive, and be free. It's also a place where Andrew Tate ran to avoid the law. Some really, really progressive stuff here. The oil boom, the ports, the hotels, the man-made beaches, the real estate, all attracted foreigners to come to the UAE and invest. But the UAE is not paradise on earth. It's not progressive, it's hell. A disgusting, vapid, soulless nation built by the labor of slaves, who have no right, no benefits, and who are locked into their contracts until death. You want to know how the UAE became like this? How they speed ran their modernization and became Western? How they're still able to maintain this expensive ass excuse of a bullshit country? Let's talk about slaves. and imperialism. The United Arab Emirates uses 3 European tactics to increase its wealth and maintain its imperial influence over Africa. The first stems from a 1644 Manual of Warfare. My professor on approaching modern Europe would ask us all some very puzzling questions. One day he gave us the 1644 Manual of Warfare, expecting all of us to read it. It's a book about pikes, troop formation, but hidden inside of it was a small detail of how the French were able to combat the English without a standing army. I didn't know the answer. I was too busy playing Age of Empires. The answer, however, was mercenaries. The Emirati states have always used slaves. Most Arab countries have, but as Walter Rodney stresses, this usage of slavery differed from plantation slavery. Although the Prophet Muhammad abolished slavery, Arabs continued the tradition to show off that they were elite. In 1837, slavery was abolished in the Gulf, and slaves were emancipated. The scholar Crane doesn't really prove that slavery was actually abolished, but to make matters simple, the Gulf states adopted a more advanced form of slavery. This kind of slavery, called kafala, resembles the slavery used in American prisons, where slaves are contracted and forced to work. The Gulf states would thus lure poor people from the third world, pay them pennies for their labor, and chain them to the state. The chains that are currently used are passports. This is a Bedouin, a nomad. This is a Badoon. Badoon is short for Badoon Jinsiya, translating to a person without a passport, a stateless person. To acquire the human labor needed to modernize, the Gulf states would buy a country's passport en masse and ship human beings to the Gulf. So you have people from India, Indonesia, and Africa all being enslaved by a dual system. A system that sponsors people, luring them in by giving them hope of employment. A system that promises wealth, and a system that chains people to the UAE. With these systems at work, the Gulf states were able to build the impossible with no workers' rights, no compensation, and slave wages. On top of this modern slavery is the plantation-like slavery found in Africa, where Africans are forced to mine diamonds and gold for the Gulf states. But how is a tiny state with a small army able to do all this? This is where the 2 European tactics add up to make a third: imperialism. The Gulf states are able to exert their power with the wealth they accumulated from the oil boom. They hire, fund, and arm mercenaries to go into Africa, subjugate and enslave the people so that the wealth is plundered, so that Dubai and Abu Dhabi continue to be cities of literal gold. Or they simply pay off poor and desperate governments to lease their mines and ports. All these tactics are found in Sudan. All these tactics have led to a genocide in Sudan. But even with the slavery, the genocide, the sex trafficking, the differences in citizens, the hell Badoon workers have to go through, I bet people will still look at the Gulf states with awe. I don't see it. I see a bunch of rotten states that'll do anything to increase their wealth, like aid a genocide in Sudan for gold, or support the genocidal Israeli state, or send mercenaries to Yemen to capture land and kill people. The UAE should cease to exist. If you're thinking of visiting, don't go to Dubai. You'll be walking on the graves of slaves. You'd be supporting slavery. And on a rare occasion, you'll see the true nature of the UAE. It's a state covered by the blood of Africans. Their blood drips down the tallest of buildings, to every wallet, to every golden bill, until it pools down to the foundation. The apathetic can't see it. They walk and dance and sing and pray in that blood. They deal with blood-soaked cash, blood that's dripping on every single golden bill. To them, the UAE is paradise, when it's actually hell. The year is 2003. America is prepping for its invasion of Iraq. The UAE is starting to slither its way into African mines, and Sudan was split by a war. However, in the war, a genocide began. The genocide happened in the most western and isolated region of Sudan, Darfur. Although the people of Darfur historically belonged to the north, they rebelled against Omar al-Bashir, the traitor of Sudan, by attacking military outposts. The reasoning behind the rebellion ties back to Walter Rodney. The people of Darfur were displeased that their region had long been ignored and underdeveloped in comparison to the rest of Sudan. The lack of development, the lack of focus on the people of Darfur ties back to Sudan's long history of focusing more on the Arab central parts while ignoring the indigenous population. Al-Bashir, like the British before him, answered by listening to the lingering ghost of Herbert Kitchener, who would brutally crush the rebellion by using the Al-Janjaweed militias to scorch the earth. What resulted was a genocide, a slaughter of 300,000 people, rape, burnings of farms, poisonings of wells, and the displacement of millions. This genocide lasted for 3 years, and at its core lay anti-black racism and Arab supremacy. The people of Darfur were dehumanized, seen as monkeys, as primitive beings. The Janjaweed went unpunished and were instead gifted parts of Darfur for their service. From 2006 to 2013, the Janjaweed militias reorganized, becoming the Rapid Support Forces. The RSF was al-Bashir's counterinsurgency tool. They were used to crush any political dissent, like in 2013, Darfur. This is when the RSF seized gold mines, but they were still in part controlled by al-Bashir, as he sent them to Yemen in 2015 to fight on the front lines instead of the Saudis and the Emiratis. Although evidence is sparse and mercenary work is shady as fuck, it was in this time period when the UAE began funding the RSF and hired them as mercenaries. Nicholas A. Harris shows evidence of the RSF going to great lengths to aid the UAE in Saudi Arabia. By this I mean doing all of the dirty work, fighting on the front lines, emptying port cities, running into ambushes, and attempting to genocide a new peoples. But Harris also shows how badly the Yemenis trashed the RSF. The RSF are like the IDF. They're great when committing a genocide, killing kids and innocent women, but when it came to a real battlefield, the people of Yemen packed the RSF and had them running. In 2019, things changed. Before al-Bashir was ousted, the RSF were sent to Libya. Who gave the command? Did they go there to secure gold? We don't know. It's all so fucking shady. But during the 2019 Sudani economic crisis, the RSF used the weakness of the state to seize more gold mines in the lusher areas of Darfur. With their power growing, they invested $1 billion into the banks of Sudan to stabilize the economy and proclaimed something grand like this: "We totally committed a genocide 17 years ago, but look at us now. We've changed. We've saved Sudan." Once al-Bashir was ousted in April 2019, power shifted in favor of the RSF. By this time, the RSF had cemented its ties to the UAE. Gold and food were smuggled out of the country through South Sudan and Uganda, feeding the RSF's war machine. From the years 2019 to 2023, a weakened transitional government ruled Sudan, and the RSF, once a tool al-Bashir used to crush his enemies, had become stronger than the Sudanese National Army. On April 15th, 2023, war broke out. The RSF seized the capital and split Sudan into two. Like in 2003, a genocide began. The RSF began to ethnically cleanse the black indigenous peoples in the region of Darfur. In having the manpower, they've enclosed the region, starving people to death. They've sieged cities and displaced over 11 million people so that the UAE can have its blood-soaked gold. But underneath that obvious motive is a white British motive to commit a genocide. Like the British, the RSF see the people of Darfur as unworthy of possessing such a rich land. And thus, like the British, like the genocidal Israelis, they are attempting to empty the land. The RSF reminds me of the colonized Sudanese in British Sudan. They resemble the colonized Algerians who aided the French in wrecking and underdeveloping their own nation. However, since April 15th, 2023, the Sudanese people and the people of Darfur haven't surrendered to the UAE-backed RSF. Rather, this war is in reality a war of liberation. It is a war of dual liberation. Liberation from the racist Arab supremacy that dehumanizes the black indigenous peoples of Sudan, and a liberation from the United Arab Emirates. I sincerely hope that with every RSF death, the UAE receives the message that they cannot just walk into a country and rob its food and its gold without any resistance. No, all of Sudan will be liberated, and I hope whoever gains power completely severs any connection with the UAE. Let it be a new trend where African countries take a stand for their sovereignty and sever all ties with the UAE. If diplomacy is not an option, they should violently force them out. Let the rich, blood-soaked states of the UAE starve. Let their land of riches dry up until their unnatural golden cities disintegrate to dust. Until that happens, there's a genocide in Sudan, and the world is silent. Revolutionary scholars who wrote in the era of decolonization often stress that within the battle of imperialism, there's a battle against apathy. Fanon wrote about how French communists cared more and supported the far, far, far away Vietnamese more than the Algerians. Fanon was a man who stood witness to the death. He stood witness to the skulls and the bones of massacred Algerians. As a medic, he stood witness to people dying in his arms, to Algerians driven mad by the horrendous French violence. Fanon wrote with fire, with violence and rage, because of what he witnessed. In part, this rage stemmed from what he had witnessed, but also from the apathy around him. In researching Sudan and the UAE simultaneously, I've noticed how Westerners gaze at awe at the UAE. They mention its past with slavery, they mention the sex trade, but the violence it inflicts is ignored. For these writers, the progress of the UAE sits at the center, not the genocidal violence. Why is that? It may be that these academics were given a guideline, limits in scope, or they were writing for a specific, apathetic, academic audience. An audience that cares more about the gold and the glamour. They're the people sitting there, puzzled, questioning how a tiny country in the Middle East has surpassed the West. So the violence needed to build such a state gets filtered. Instead, the focus of these books are on oil, daring gambles, trade negotiations, and political talks. The blood needed to create such a hellish state is dismissed. The neo-colonial and imperial projects are tossed out of the window to perfect the progressive image of the UAE. In my humble opinion, fuck that. I want it to be honest. On the other hand, there's Sudan, a history that was more difficult to research than Palestine because the resources are so scarce, or I didn't know where to fish. The first two books I read were British apologia, books that dismissed the effects of genocidal violence has on a people, books that praised and worshipped the British for civilizing Sudan, books that make it seem that British colonization helped Sudan. Fuck these scholars and their dishonest, pathetic portrayal of history. Tying this project all together, it basically made this video possible, was Walter Rodney's book on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. You could feel the Fanon in Rodney's words. The same fire, the same rage. In those rageful words, I understood Sudan's relationship with UAE better. I understood that, like under the British, the Sudanese government were agents of the Gulf. willing to send mercenaries who committed a genocide to help the UAE conquer Yemen. Thank God Yemen fought and humiliated the RSF.
أن نقول لكل أولئك الأعداء وكل من تحالفوا مع الضعيف الأمريكي نقول لهم إن بحرنا الأحمر سيزداد احمرارا من دمائكم ومن أراد منكم أن يطلع على جهنم فليأتي إلى بحرنا الأحمر وتهددوننا بالحرب أيها الأغبياء أو ما علمتم أن أهل الحرب أنتم عندما تهددوننا بالحرب أنتم كمن يهدد مريضا بالعافية تعالوا واحشدوا جيوشكم وشداد آفاقكم فالويل لكم الويل يا من جاء يبغي ذلنا.
But Walter Rodney stresses that for European colonization to have worked, they needed colonized people in the inside. The UAE is the same. They may hire mercenaries to secure gold mines, but they vitally need African governments to cooperate. And they need the West. They need you to remain apathetic to their many, many crimes. Whenever I make a video, any video, at the core of each video is a goal to affect people's hearts, to shake them, even a tiny little bit. To do this, I borrow the rage and anger of Fanon, George Jackson, and Walter Rodney, and mix it with my own. Because how does one look at Sudan, a place that has experienced multiple genocides, and be apathetic? How does one care more about the blood-dripping slave states of the UAE more than Sudan? For me, Sudan is connected to the struggle against imperialism. Sudan is linked to Yemen and Palestine. You can't go around fighting one genocide while ignoring the others. So as I always call for the downfall of the genocidal Israeli state, I also call and pray for the downfall of the UAE. It'll happen. But until it does, support the people who are currently suffering in Sudan. And I hope the comments are filled with 3 simple words. Fuck the UAE.
But most importantly, this building is for all the people of Dubai, which is today the tallest building in the
Hey, welcome to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. On your way out, don't forget to share and subscribe. Please rate this video on how depressing it was. I'm expecting a lot of skulls. I also want to clarify something. The Badoons were not shipped to the UAE. There is human trafficking there, but the Badoons are basically stateless people. People who were brought from India and Pakistan in the 1950s when Sheikh Rashid was building the ports and modernizing Dubai. So to fill the gap, he brought in a lot of illegal workers. Countries like to complain about illegal workers, but they use them as cheap slave labor. What happened in the 2000s was that since the Badoons had kids and were away for so long, they had lost their nationalities, becoming stateless. The emirs of the UAE refused to give the Badoons an Emirati citizenship, and they didn't want to deport their slaves, so they went to the Conmore Islands and bought citizenship. So these Badoons woke up the next day becoming citizens of a random ass island. It's absolutely absurd and twisted because, like, why don't you just give these people your citizenship? Why don't you just nationalize them? Why can't they be Emiratis? You fucking dumb shits. You know, like why did you go to a random island next to I think it's near Madagascar and buy the citizenship of them just so these people do not become Emiratis? Like that's the length these fucking emirs go to keep their slaves in bondage and chains. It's so fucked up. I wanted to clarify the situation of the Badoons because I was just ranting and raving about dishonest historians. I'm gonna flip a coin to decide what's next. I really want to do Castlevania, but the world seems to be calling for a video on doomerism and apathy. The world out there is scary. The fascists want you to be apathetic, to submit to give in to their fascist futures. But I'm here to tell you that the future isn't lost. It isn't a lost future. Budai.